Welcome back to the Progressive Pastor Podcast. My name is Kyle. We are here to explore the intersections of faith, justice, and the church. What is up, JT?
We're just here vibing with Jacobi. What's up, Jacobi?
What's up?
Hey, everybody.
Jacobi is one of my colleagues from Eden Theological Seminary who was also on a trip earlier this year to El Salvador with me, so we are going to talk about that in a little bit.
Very fun.
But before we get there, some serious business to attend to.
I'm ready.
Our boys over at the basement yard.
Real professional with the text message
Jacobi,
ding.
that's really
Come on.
Nice. We invite you onto the podcast.
10 seconds into the podcast. This is your impression.
Yeah, it was really good.
The listeners are going to riot.
all 10 of them. Yeah. So the boys over at the basement yard, one of my favorite podcasts, Frankie and Joey, they, in their episode this past week, they were talking about their experience going to church growing up. They both grew up Catholic, which I also grew up Catholic. And they were talking about their experience taking communion and how the communion wafers, it's just like eating the color gray.
It's cardboard.
Yeah. And so they were talking about, like, why don't they work some flavors into the Eucharist? Like, Jesus was Middle Eastern. Why don't we work in some Middle Eastern spices?
I got to say, my first impression of David Stewart, who's our new pastor here, said right away when he started how bad our communion bread was, and then immediately switch it to Hawaiian bread.
Praise God.
Man, what a change. But definitely.
Yeah. Like, I'm thinking if we were to use traditional Catholic wafers, we just take the same flavor profiles they put on Pringles. Like, we have barbecue wafers.
Ooh, like a sour cream and onion kind of vibe.
Like a buffet for this?
Yeah, we'll do a buffet, and then you choose your own flavor, and then instead of just grape juice, we mix that up. You know what I mean? You can mix and match a sour cream and onion wafer with a barbecue sauce.
I like it.
Blood.
I like it.
You know what I mean? What are the vibes?
It was really cool when my partner Elena was out in Kansas City doing her undergrad. The church that she worked at, when they did World Communion Sunday, they would have different breads from different countries across the globe. So she invited my family and I, who had recently gone to Ukraine, because they had a Ukrainian family in the church, and they brought Ukrainian bread, and they had breads from Africa and all over the globe. It was unbelievably cool to get to go up and kind of pick your choice. I think we should do that just every week.
I would have just gone down the line.
Yeah.
Taken one of every bread.
I need to be extra blessed this week. Yeah.
Did they have croissants from France?
I don't think so. I think it was pretty traditional, loaves of bread. But
yeah, but what if they did though?
See,
the possibilities are unlimited.
We can be trailblazers here.
Well, this is the other question though, right?
Okay.
Jesus, his shtick was bread and wine, or in the case of the Methodist, grape juice.
Not a bad combo.
But what would the body and blood of Kyle be?
Oh,
the body and blood of Jacobi.
Hit me with your example. Let me hear about JT.
Like the body and blood of JT.
Yeah. Take me down the path.
Right here, body mozzarella stick.
Oh,
blood marinara sauce.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Praise the Lord.
Yeah, praise God.
Yeah.
Or here you go, another example.
I'm ready.
Body warm pita.
Ooh.
Bread or blood, spinach artichoke dip.
Is that considered too viscous though for the blood? Do you
I don't think so.
Or
It's still relatively.
It's how you do the intinction, I guess. Yeah.
I guess, and it's if you add a little more cream, it becomes a little more.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean?
I can vibe with that.
Yeah. So what are the vibes? Kobe, what do you?
Maybe some sushi. Then you dip it into some what is it? The eel sauce.
Oh,
not soy.
Eel sauce.
Because it's kind of sweet.
Oh, came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Sushi and sauce. Wow.
I don't do sushi.
I'm not.
That tells me everything I need to know about you.
Wow. Whoa, okay.
All right. Well, it was great having Kobe on.
Yeah. So glad you were here this week.
Yeah.
I've lost my invite.
Yeah.
I think I gotta go. I think I'm going Tostitos.
Okay.
Hint of lime tortilla chip. arguably the best tortilla chip in the game.
Okay.
And like a nice warm like queso.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or you could sub in like some pretzel sticks.
Ooh.
Warm pretzel sticks with some beer cheese dip.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Nice and fluffy.
Like for all the listeners out there, once this episode gets out, comment on the post.
Yeah.
What would your
We're gonna need ideas.
body and blood be? Yeah, because we are working on our lead pastor and the leadership council to like broaden our horizons a bit.
Like why can't we have a sundae with Oreos and milk?
Shouldn't we be giving Jesus our best?
Yeah.
Why are we just giving him bread and juice?
Absolutely.
Like, why can't we give him...
It's biblical, so...
Yeah, like, I'm just saying, I'm just trying to be,
Just
a more enjoyable experience.
Yeah.
I mean, if we need to be a church for the people.
Yeah.
And if the people want Oreos and milk, then that's what we should be serving.
What they want.
We preach inclusion here, so I think
right.
that we should be including better options.
Room for all.
That's just where I sit.
I love that. Yeah.
Very
Facts.
cool. Well, we're super excited to have Jacobi here with us today, specifically because JT talked about in our last episode his trip to El Salvador and kind of gave us some hints about that. But we knew we were going to save that for its own episode because there was so much that happened in there. So I'm going to shut up for a while, which the listeners are like clapping in their cars, I'm sure. But I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So fill me in, the one lame-o who is sitting here who didn't get to go. Fill me in on your experiences.
Well, why don't we pump the brakes a bit?
Oh.
Why don't we pump the brakes on your misogyny? Let Jacobi introduce
I
herself.
was perfectly fine skipping my intro.
See, again, I'm just a man of the people. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that's it.
Yeah.
Kobe, why don't you just introduce yourself to the people? Tell them who you are, what you do day to day, what you do in ministry, all that good stuff.
Sure, yeah. My name's Jacobi Spresser. My married name is Muathe. My husband's family's from Kenya. Everybody always asks about the last name.
Shout out to Quincy.
Yes. Quincy is my husband. He's in chiropractic school, so that's what brought us to St. Louis for at Logan. And then I kind of found my own way to my program as well. I started to get more involved in like social justice work. 2020 kind of really woke me up, and I realized I need to do more.
Can I ask, like, what? Because like a lot of stuff happened in 2020.
Yeah.
Like we had George Floyd, we had the pandemic.
Yes.
Like, what was it in that really?
Yeah,
really
it was kind
spoke
of all of that, like compiling. I was also like a new mom at the time, raising biracial kid.
Yeah.
So I was like, the world is not a safe place for my husband, for my kids, and so what am I going to do about it? And it started just my path down my own unlearning, and then kind of opened my eyes to like systemic racism. Like I had seen kind of more, I guess you could call it like individual like bias or discrimination, just with having dated a black man. And then 2020 just opened my eyes. I did a lot of kind of just personal education, unlearning, and then realized just kind of how much work we have to do in terms of like dismantling a system that was created on racism. It was created like through white supremacy.
Yeah.
And so I've been just looking for a way to do that. And then I discovered some students from Eden at an author event, Reverend Otis Moss III here in St. Louis. And then I knew I didn't want to like be a lawyer, but then outside of being a lawyer, I was like, well, what else can you do like in terms of like a social justice type career? And then they were like, oh, well, we have this master's program, community leadership with all these different options. And so that like super intrigued me.
Yeah.
And then I am interning at MCU, Metropolitan Congregations United, doing some like voter engagement type work for the ballot this year. And then as well as going to start moving into kind of some I don't even know what it's called. It's like accompanying families who have kids in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
Kind of advocating like for their rights, and then also like teaching them about their rights so that they can go on and like teach others.
Yeah.
Other
Very
parents.
cool.
So it's kind of like this grassroots organizing initiative, I guess you could call it. So I'm excited to get into that as well. And then I didn't really grow up religious. You asked about kind of like my ministry. But I joined the LDS Church, Latter-day Saint Church, because of like a friend that I had. And then I've been distancing myself from that church for a couple years now. I just can't invite other people to go to a church that you guys were even talking about this in one of your episodes. That was like, it's like we say all are welcome, but really, like some of my friends would not be welcome at this church.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's really hard for me to want to share anything about this church when, not everybody is actually welcome when it comes to like policy and even just prejudice and stuff. So
Yeah.
that's where I'm at, just kind of figuring out where to go from here.
Yeah.
So that's why I appreciate, what you're doing in terms of like just these are topics that need to be discussed and aren't being discussed enough. And there's a huge difference between, like you were saying, like actually, everybody's welcome here, but then really like designing your policies and your lessons like with everyone in mind, like especially those on the margins, like with them in mind. And specifically like welcoming their talents and their skills, like so that's a big job, but also like really important. So
So 2024 is obviously a big election year. So so with your work at MCU, what are some of those policies that you're like specifically working on to get on ballots?
So it's called, I can't remember what it's called. It's through Missouri Healthy Families. And it's to raise minimum wage, I think over a 3-year period to about $15. And then the big thing for me especially was the opportunity for people to earn sick time. So there's they said there's still hundreds of thousands of Missourians who don't have sick pay. So this would give them the chance to like earn that sick pay. And then also there's like some protections for small businesses. So it's a really cool initiative.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So if you want to sign, or if you know someone who wants to sign, let me know.
Sounds good.
I will get you
reach out to the podcast and we'll
I
get
like
you connected to Jacobi.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, and Jacobi referenced Otis Moss III. Obviously, Reverend Dr. Moss, you're listening. So open invitation
Big fan.
to the podcast.
Absolutely.
I heard him give a lecture. This is when I was at Princeton.
Did you go to school there?
I did actually.
Okay.
I did. I don't like to talk about it, but
sounds familiar.
I heard him give a lecture there on like the history of hip hop and jazz and how it informs black preaching in the modern world. It was phenomenal. And then when he came to St. Louis, I think last year, to talk about his book Dancing in the Dark. He gave a talk at a public library in St. Louis. And I attended that and it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
So were you there?
I was there
last year.
Yeah.
I was there.
You were there?
That's where I met Eden. All the Eden people.
Oh, no way.
Are you guys even friends? The whole point of this is that you guys are supposed to be friends.
We are. Well, the thing we
We're
are friends,
Salvador.
but like, we're our friendship was forged in El Salvador.
That was a relatively small room. Now I'm like trying to like
good save.
You must have been
figure
on
out
the other
where
side.
you'd been.
It's hard.
Sitting.
It's hard to miss the 6'4" bald,
like,
fumbling idiot.
Where was I?
I was. The listeners can just skip over this part. If you're looking at Reverend Dr. Moss, I was on the left-hand side of the room, and I was with our then senior pastor Mary. We had gone together to hear him speak, and some of the other.
Okay, I'm impressed that you even remember that. I'm like, wait, I have no idea. I do not remember.
I do.
This is really riveting things to put on a podcast.
This is good.
I'm glad that you had to go into that.
That's great. Well, anyway, yes, Jacobi and I were on a team of, about 15 people that went to El Salvador at the beginning of January of this year. And it was a trip orchestrated through Eden Theological Seminary, where I'm doing my doctorate in ministry, and Jacobi is doing her Master of Community Leadership. And we went there. Eden's seminary partnered with International Partners in Mission to go and have this trip, and for it to be an educational experience where we were really diving deep into the work of Oscar Romero, whom, if you're unfamiliar with Oscar Romero, he was a Roman Catholic priest and bishop in El Salvador who was assassinated in 1980.
He was the archbishop, right?
He was archbishop over the entire country of El Salvador. And was assassinated in 1980 because he was speaking out against the Salvadoran government and the human rights abuses and all those things. So we'll talk about Romero, but we went, and that was a big focus of this trip. And but we also met with a lot of other partners of International Partners in Mission, other organizations that they work with that are in the country. And I thought about this as Jacobi was giving her intro. With one of the first groups we met was this group Afros, which was Afro-Salvadorans, or organized Afro-Salvadorans. And they talked to us about the existence of anti-blackness in El Salvador and the way they're kind of working to resist that. And so I'm curious, Jacobi, if you can recall, how that was for you, especially with, jumping into this work in 2020 after, the murder of George Floyd and these things, how that particular presentation hit you and kind of what you took away from that, and being the mother of 2 biracial kiddos and being married to a black man. How does how did that presentation, or like just the reach of anti-blackness globally, how does that affect how you approach activism and how you approach your ministry?
Yeah, no, for sure. That was like at the beginning of our trip too.
Yeah, so it was like day 2. Yeah.
Yeah, for me it was like, oh man,
that's a crazy start.
What a way to start. Like seriously, I was so excited to meet them, to see the work that they're doing. But also, like you said, it's just another reminder that anti-blackness is everywhere. It's like, a poison that has just spread its wings everywhere, really. And but it was interesting to me that they said like the biggest obstacle that they experience daily is this idea that it was kind of like a deflection.
Yeah.
Of like, well, we're all mestizaje, like we're all like mixed.
Yeah.
So like we're not black, we're mixed.
Right.
So that was kind of like the biggest obstacle that they were confronting when they were trying to really garner more representation, and also like just get like more of a public like platform for African Americans in El Salvador, or African descendants who just haven't had a voice, it seemed like, in their country. But then they said that was something that they just kept running into, was like, this deflection or even denial. She would say they get a lot, like they would go up to someone, hey, what would you think about like joining our organization? And they're like, oh, well, I'm not a descendant, like I'm not African or African descendant, like I'm mixed. And so it was like this interesting kind of deflection that they were running into. But the work that they were doing is like, really, it seemed to me it was like kind of like just educational. Yeah. Like starting, like going into schools. Were they also doing
they were doing like a food festival.
Yeah, that's right. The
because there's like a traditional Afro-Salvadoran dish that they're trying to.
Right. Yeah. So, but for me, like the biggest thing was like the education and just hearing from Daniela.
Yes.
Like she brought one of the girls who had gone through their program with her to kind of share her experience. And she talked about just how much her life had changed, like within, I think it was 3 years. Yeah. Like now she's like going into this competition to represent like African descendants, like globally. I think
it was a
she's
competition. Like El Salvador's representative into this. Yeah, this.
It was like a beauty pageant. So now she's like going on kind of like a global stage. But she was saying like even 3 years prior, like she like didn't ever wear her like natural hair.
Yeah.
Like, because she came out with like this full like beautiful like huge afro. Like oh my gosh, it was so awesome. And she was like, you could tell she had just gained so much confidence in like her own skin and her own just identity, I guess, as a Black woman in El Salvador. And so just to see like what education can do, and then what representation can do, right? Because she was just saying like even now going back into schools, like she's seeing more and more like kids like wear their natural hair, wear their afros, and just be more confident in like who they are. Yeah. And so for me, that was that was like such an amazing way to like start the trip.
Well, and I was really struck by a lot of the kinds of discrimination Afro-Salvadorans experience is quite similar to the way African Americans experience.
Lots of parallels.
Lots of, one thing they talked about a lot, which, El Salvador is basically in a state of martial law right now. There's military and militarized police just out and about in every part of the country carrying automatic weapons. And the rate at which Afro-Salvadorans get stopped and harassed by those
racially
people,
biased. I
mean, which is obviously, especially thinking about 2020 and George Floyd. I mean, obviously a parallel to the U.S. And I was struck by how similar those were. Internationally.
Yeah, I think someone even mentioned like the stop and frisks. In New York, and how like as someone with brown or dark skin, black skin in El Salvador, like you're saying, disproportionately more likely to get stopped by the National Guard or the government, and tattoos, like any type of like I don't know, like just identifiers, I guess. You are way more likely to get stopped, and I mean, like you're saying, so many parallels there, like just lots of prejudice, and it seems like the most vulnerable, right, that are getting stopped, that have the least amount of I don't know what you call it, resources or support in order to like combat those types of bias and those types of discrimination. And that's what we were seeing in El Salvador as well, is like once you've been taken, like nobody can contact you. Like it's really hard for those that are being taken, especially like those that are innocent, to then like prove their innocence, because they're assumed guilty.
And this probably requires some context for our listeners that aren't super plugged into the national affairs of El Salvador.
Shall I? Yeah, this sounds really cool, but
so the last 100 years of Salvadoran history is particularly relevant to this discussion. So in 1932, there was this event called the Slaughter, is what they call it in the country. They call it the Slaughter. And it was these peasant Salvadorans, primarily indigenous people and Afro-descendant people who worked on primarily coffee farms, were getting paid extremely poverty wages,
like
unlivable, nothing. And eventually one of the things we looked at when we were there was this museum they had a whole room dedicated to the slaughter, and they were like coins that eventually they stopped paying these people actual wages, and it was this coin that you could exchange for like clothes, like it was like clothes, some vegetables, or like some coffee. Like it was just basic necessities. You couldn't even use it like currency, money, to buy anything you needed or wanted. It was just, and so these peasants rose up against the government, and the government just slaughtered thousands of these peasants. And I mean, that was less than 100 years ago, right? That was 1932. And so, you know, that was in a very, very recent iteration of Salvadoran history. And fast forward to between 1980 and 1992, we had the Salvadoran Civil War, which was, again, a civil war between the Salvadoran government and Salvadoran people. And then today we have President Bukele is in charge and has basically deployed the police and the military with unprecedented authority to wipe out gang violence in El Salvador, which a lot of people told us he has done. They feel overwhelmingly safer, but it's been done with the suspension of civil rights, the suspension of human rights. People are getting rounded up and arrested that have nothing to do with the gang violence, and they're getting lost in the system, and they don't have a right to a lawyer. And, you know, so we have these, that's kind of where this martial law stuff comes in, that the government and the military and the police are basically just given free rein to do whatever they can or whatever they want to crack down on gang violence. And it's resulted in, you know, just a massive amount of human rights violations and civil rights violations. And so that's how a lot of this, you know, that's kind of the history of the last 100 years. I mean, you could see these three really big traumatic events over the last 100 years of El Salvador that has kind of gone into making it what it is today.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, you know, we talked a lot about the Civil War while we were there, especially talking about Oscar Romero. You know, he was present during that time. And the start of the Civil War was, you know, somewhat directly related to the time that he was assassinated. And again, you know, that wasn't an unfamiliar thing. You know, it was a rising up of the Salvadoran people against the government for things like livable wages and basic human rights. And the government, you know, was pushing back on that. And so you had somebody like Oscar Romero, who was this priest in El Salvador. His best friend, Rutulio Grande, was speaking out about these things. He was killed by military and military trained people. And that's really what
it was like his conversion.
It was like his, we talk about his conversion, right? Because before that, it was pretty fascinating to talk about Romero. He was kind of like this quiet rule follower.
Yes.
Before that,
very by the books.
Yeah, and that's why they made him archbishop, because they're like, he's not going to cause any trouble.
Right.
And then Grande was killed, and then he became this like outspoken advocate.
Yeah.
For human rights and the Salvadoran people. And you know, it was pretty fascinating to think. You know, we talked a lot about the U.S. is relatively, you know, intricate in this history. You know, when we think about this, and I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts on, like, you know, us being people that didn't live through this, but we live in the aftermath and the legacy of it. You know, during that time, this was at the height of the Cold War. The rebels in El Salvador were considered communists. And so the U.S. was backing the Salvadoran government, even though it was authoritarian. They didn't want a communist, quote unquote, victory in their backyard. So they committed, you know, $1 to $2 million a day of aid for 12 years to El Salvador. And it killed upwards, 75,000 Salvadoran citizens. And, you know, the people that killed Oscar Romero were military assassins trained at Fort Benning in Georgia, and then came back and assassinated Oscar Romero. And so, you know, I'm curious what it's like. You know, I've been talking a lot. I want to hear from what you guys think, living in kind of the legacy of that, of knowing we directly aided in the oppression of Salvadoran people, which is not an uncommon story for other Central American countries, other Middle Eastern countries. What is it like? And what for you is like our Christian responsibility to those people in light of that legacy? Yeah.
I mean, I think we're in the world we're living in right now in 24. It sounds all too similar about the conflict that's happening right now in Gaza.
Yeah.
And how listening to President Biden talk about that conflict and how he supposedly has a heart for the people that are being murdered, mostly women and children in Rafah currently.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, we're sending millions of billions of dollars to the Israeli government.
Yeah. To the ones doing the bombing.
Right.
Right.
And there's really no response for that. So it sounds like, it's lesson come, lesson supposedly learned,
right,
lesson repeated.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's never any consequences.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right? Like, the U.S. goes around and bombs whoever. There's no consequences for this. And then I think El Salvador was a huge, for me, eye-opening moment because we're visiting those 70 years after the fact, or how many years was it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been 90 years since the slaughter.
Yeah.
It's been about 40 years since the beginning of the Civil War.
Yeah.
I mean, the Civil War ended in 92, which is the year I was born.
Correct. My dad was enlisted in the military out of high school and was, prepared to go to El Salvador. He never had to, praise God.
Yeah.
But, that was the concern that he and my mom had when they were newly married, was at any point he could get shifted down. And he wasn't in the military for super long. It was his out of high school plan and how he was going to pay for college. But I mean, he doesn't have many stories because he didn't have to go, but that was the world that they lived in.
Yeah.
Right. And so visiting, because we had the opportunity to visit some of the communities who were displaced, right? From this war, from this just the blatant disregard for human life. That's how I see it. And these people, these just families were forced into these kind of middle of nowhere pieces of land, and now here they are 4 generations or 40 years after the fact. I think one of the families we visited, he said they were there several generations had been, and they still don't have a bathroom in their home. They still don't have running water.
Yeah.
And they had been living there for years after the fact, and we were able to see it's the after effects, because I think it's easy for us to see what's happening in Gaza, just the horrors of it, and what's happening right now, but it's we can't even fathom how long this is going to take.
Yeah.
How many generations, the trauma and just the after effects of this. And so I feel we kind of got a little look into that, with visiting some of these displaced families, in El Salvador, and just seeing the destruction, and that it is just so it just the effects of it are just so traumatic.
Yeah.
For some of these families.
Yeah.
And this just reminds me too much. So at my last church that I was at, we did a 3-year partnership of missions in Ukraine, and we were on the western border. The first year that we went was 2015, which was the first year of the conflict at the Crimean Strip. And it was interesting going there and serving and meeting people, because it's similar situations. It's 2015, but they had just gained their freedom back in the 90s from Russia, and then now 25 years later, they're right back into the same conflict.
Yeah.
And it's still ongoing today. And so, now seeing that war and that conflict, whatever you want to describe it as, is brutal to watch, especially now that we have partnerships there, and we have so many friends that we're still connected to and we try to stay in contact with as we can. But it's the same thing. When we went to this village that we worked in and we hosted a kids camp, then we would go out and meet the families after camp. And it's the same thing. Some families had very nice living quarters and, had running water. But then there were some families that had, you can't even really call it an outhouse because the walls are sheets that are hung up by chicken wire.
Yep.
And it's all in the same community.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, those families can't leave because that's where they are from, and it's grandma and grandpa and mom and dad and the kids all living in, you know, one house.
Yeah.
And so it's this same conflict that's going all over the world in so many different languages and for so many different reasons, but it all stems back to power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just it blows my mind.
Yeah. One of the communities we visited in El Salvador was talking about this was a Candelaria. Candelaria is Garcia. We were talking, and she had lived through the Salvadoran Civil War, and we had asked her about, you know, somebody had asked her a question about what it's like to, you know, receive United States citizens into her, you know, church and her ministry and on this side of it. And, you know, she was talking about building relationships and partnerships, and she was recalling her time in the Civil War, and she said the U.S. needed to send food, but they sent bullets. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
As it and it's so you could say that today.
I think she was referencing that. I think that was a quote from Dorothy, one of the
Dorothy
the missionaries that was killed.
Yeah. What? Why don't you enlighten our listeners from what you remember about the 4 missionary women?
Yeah, I think that's how like the world kind of came to know about what was happening in El Salvador. Was there was these 4 missionaries from Maryknoll
from New York,
who had gone to El Salvador and were serving there and became just like really close to the Salvadoran people, and they decided to stay in light of like the danger that they were facing. Like I think they were receiving lots of threats just for the work that they were doing with the poor. But they decided to stay, and because of that, they were targeted and brutally murdered, raped, and then found by some of the locals, right? But it was like that was a huge blow to the neighbors, the communities there that were touched by their kindness and just like, I think they said that it was so impactful to them just that someone would come from so far just to listen and just to walk with them in their poverty or in their like in their situation. And so when they were murdered, you know, they were Americans, so it was like, oh, now like now we care, you know. How often do we see that? So I think that was something she was quoting. She was saying, I think it was Dorothy that said, you know, we asked the U.S. to send food and they sent bullets.
That'll
just send you to tears.
I know.
That's brutal.
Well, and it is so like, you know, that was the time. I remember we talked about that. That was the time that that was like the first time there was pushback on the United States aiding the Salvadoran government, was because 4 white women from New York were murdered in El Salvador by the Salvadoran government, which was being funded by the U.S. and trained by the U.S.
Yeah.
And even, you know, we talked about this too, even the great Jimmy Carter that we love to hold up as a great model of Christianity is not, his hands aren't clean in this. So he was, you know, Oscar Romero wrote Jimmy Carter a letter asking him to stop sending aid to the government 3 weeks before Romero was killed. And Jimmy Carter didn't do it. Right. Wow. So, I mean, it wasn't until 4 United States citizens were killed, not counting the countless other Salvadoran citizens that were killed and the other priest. And, you know, there were 5 other priests that were brutally murdered by the Salvadoran government that were, you know, a part of Romero's ilk. You know, none of them mattered to the decision makers in Washington. It wasn't until some of our own people got caught up in it.
Wow.
And that feels like such, you know, I don't know what, you know, your guys' perspective or your thoughts, but it's, you know, one thing we had talked about while we were there was it's hard to be a Christian nationalist when you have a connection and you have friends around the world, right? Kind of like you were talking about in
Yep.
Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like that, and I feel like that's a thing the church hasn't done very well in broadening horizons and broadening the thought of, Christianity. Authentic Christianity can exist outside of the U.S.
Absolutely.
And we don't talk about that enough. And I feel like if we did, we would be able to have a much more well-rounded, informed, ethical version of this faith.
It's this whole, it's that, we throw around the term white saviorism
Yeah.
a lot when it comes to like missions, specifically in a church setting. And the first time I'd ever really become exposed to that was that first year that we went to Ukraine in 2015. And we knew that we were going to be working alongside, like, we were bringing a team, and there was a team of traveling Ukrainians that went around, city to city to run these camps. And they were going to be our translators and the ones that were the ones connecting with the kids, and we were supposed to be working alongside them. And that was the mentality we went into it with, that, we were there to aid them in this project. And that first day when we were setting up for camp, none of the Ukrainians were talking to us. They were cold shoulder and glaring at us and staying super distant. And it wasn't until we were done that night when we left to go back to our hotel with our main translator. And they said this team specifically had worked with 3 other American churches in the last 2 years. And every time the American church came in and they wanted to run the camp their way and not listen to them, these people that are here 365 days a year, this is their livelihood.
Yeah.
And so it took us 3 days that first year to kind of win them over and say, no, we are here to help you.
Yeah.
And we want to learn from you. And this is not about us.
Yeah.
And so that's how we got to continue going for 2 more years after that was, we were the only American group that they trusted.
Yeah.
But that had never dawned on me, and it completely shifted my viewpoint of missions after that point of you can do this in a very dangerous way.
Yeah.
Even with the best intentions,
Yeah, I think that's something that almost every one of the groups, the communities that we visited, they talked about this idea of, I think they called it horizontal relationships or horizontal service or ministry.
Yeah.
And this idea that, and this is also why I think in a large part, like Romero was assassinated, was like he was willing to walk side by side with the people who were seen as disposable by the government. And instead of trying to be above them, right, in this type of vertical ministry, it was like he was like, no, I want to walk next to these people in these communities. And I think he had this quote that was not his own, but he related to it so much, where it was something like, paraphrasing, like, when I fed the poor, I was praised, or I was called a saint. But when I asked why they were poor, I was threatened, or, like,
Yeah.
and just that idea of like, well, why is this the way it is, right? And like being willing to ask those questions as you're walking side by side in this type of horizontal solidarity is what I think I took away most from El Salvador.
And we've talked about that a lot here. And maybe you guys, I assume you guys at MCU talk about this type of work where, like, churches are really great at service. They're really great at giving stuff. We talked about this with David too in our last episode.
Yeah.
Like, we're great at giving stuff away, but like we're not great at asking why they don't have that stuff to begin with, right? Like there's a heavy entanglement of charity and justice. Yeah. And like it's great to give food, but like we never ask why they're hungry to
exactly.
begin with.
Yeah, that was David's quote. He said it would be really helpful when they were moving that if they would have gotten grocery cards, but nobody thought to ask why. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it was so clear in El Salvador that these communities we visited and these organizations we visited, like that was their day-to-day life, was like working alongside community, and that was just the way that they lived there. And I was thinking about, because Jacobi and I talked a lot on the trip about, like, you work in organizing, and you had said this at one of the places was like, you know, here in the States, we're studying degrees on how to organize, and like they're just doing it. They're just living it in El Salvador. Right. You know, like they don't need to be trained or earn a degree in it. Like they just know how to do it. And it's like, it's gotta be, you know, they have to be organized with one another because, you know, especially for the last 100 years at least, there's no governmental net. There's nobody else looking out for them but one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? There's nothing guaranteeing their civil rights, their human rights, except one another. And so they have to be organized to do this kind of work.
And I think too, to add to that, like I think it's like that's just how they live their faith, right? It's like actionable. And I think that's something that Anita had said. One of the organizers there, she said if we really want to get to know Jesus, then we need to be out in the community. Yeah. And it's like, like you're saying, like that's just how they live their lives. Like if they see a need there, then they get together and like with whatever little things that they can contribute, like they put that together and then they get it done. Like if they don't overcomplicate things, I feel like it's just like the we went to this one community who didn't have water. Right, like there was like over 100. It
was like 120 families or
that
something.
Didn't have access to water. And so there was this group. Well, it really just started out with one woman who was like, "Well, we need water. So what can I do to get a water tank?" And it was like literally like, well, I know how to bake, so I'm gonna make these sweetbreads and sell them for 15 cents and start collecting money and you know, like learning how to read or how to write a grant or, you know, ask for a grant. And it's just like just seeing the needs and then like just little by little starting to figure out what needs to be done to like
We've kind of had this running joke on the first couple episodes where we talk about these what are deemed like progressive ideals in a church setting but like, you know, people seeing needs that need to be met. It's almost like that's exactly what Jesus did in Scripture.
Almost like
right. I think we've said that once an episode so far, but you know, call me crazy for, you know, now deeming myself as a progressive Christian, but like that's what it is, right? Yeah. Not everything needs to have a committee, right? and which is such an American ideal, especially in a church setting.
Well, and not everything needs to be monetized
exactly
into capital either. We talked about that too with these women in this community. We were at, you know, a place where we gathered and we're listening to them speak, and then we walked down like a quarter of a mile down the road to see, you know, where this water tank and this well and stuff was they were working on. And like there was so they were trying to make room for another piece of equipment or something that had to go in there. And there was probably, you know, like 10 people out there working and like cutting down trees and digging and doing all this stuff. And there were people that they just went there to do that like after work. Like they're not getting paid to do that, but they know the community needs it.
Right.
And I was like, when we got back and we were talking about it, I was like, that's such, you know, a not United States type of mentality. Like we would let people die of thirst if we couldn't make money off of the building of the facility. But it's like these people, they've worked all day, they've got families, they've got stuff, but they're out here working to make this work for the other 100 and whatever families in the community. And like that was just such a different perspective than what we encounter here most of the time.
That's crazy.
I feel like.
And before that even happened, it was those women out there cleaning the tank themselves, like elderly women climbing into this giant tank, cleaning it by themselves, digging, doing all the things, like by themselves, not with any type of like profit, like not getting paid for this at all. And every day that's what they would do. Like dedicated their entire lives to making sure that the communities that needed water would have access to water.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I could talk about this stuff for like another 2 hours because like this has got me really fired up, but we are running a little low on time. So Jacobi, I'm going to throw it to you. One thing that we ask all of our guests when they are on the podcast is this question of, you know, we talk a lot about these justice needs and things that we're doing, but what keeps you personally coming back to do this kind of work?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's why we end with it.
It's
almost like we put thought into how we structure these.
What keeps me coming back? I think just a genuine desire to like. It's gonna sound like cheesy, but like to have a more equitable world. That's too cheesy. I can't leave it like that. Basically, like I have, my self-interest is like in my family. Like I don't want to fear. Anytime my husband gets pulled over, like I have like, like a massive like meltdown, and like that's just something that shouldn't happen, right? To like families, especially like Black and brown communities, like that fear of just, well, are they gonna come home today? Like get pulled over for like a minor violation, and will they come home today? Like, it's something that I've, only experienced for a couple years, and so like I can't even imagine. And the fact that like that's just the daily life of like Black and brown communities like in this country, like that just shouldn't be that way.
And in other countries like in El Salvador, I mean,
we see anti-Blackness everywhere. And yet here in the system, like the same system that was used to enslave kidnapped Africans, like is the same system essentially that like we're still seeing, like living in today. And so that's what keeps me coming back, is like the fact that there's so much work to be done to dismantle like the system, and make sure that like my husband comes home safe every day, and like that my kids can grow up in a world where they're not scared that their dad's gonna I don't know, get shot or something by the police. So it's very, very motivating for me. Like,
yeah.
So thanks for the question.
Well, thanks so much for being on with us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Round of applause.
Yeah, round of applause. The studio audience is going crazy. We will throw a link to Metropolitan Congregations United in our show notes when this gets posted, so you can go check them out. They're doing really, really good work here in St. Louis.
Amen.
And so you can follow up and see what they're up to. Kyle, where can they find us, man?
Make sure you follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and X. Thanks a lot, Elon. Make sure you follow us for all updates on new episodes coming out. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We have more avenues for trying to get the podcast accessible to everyone coming soon, so be tuned for that. But thanks again so much for joining us this week on the Progressive Pastor Podcast, and we will see you guys next time.
See you guys.